We spend so much time talking about brain health, diet, exercise, managing stress, blood pressure,
Yeah,
all of that stuff.
right. The usual suspects.
But what about hearing? It kind of feels separate, doesn't it?
It does, and that's exactly why this is so interesting. There's actually a really crucial link there between hearing health, something maybe you haven't thought much about,
Okay.
and the big concern around cognitive decline, even dementia.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then, to really get into that connection. We're looking at a specific study to see what the science says and why it matters for you.
Exactly. We're focusing today on a pretty significant study out of Brazil called the LSA Brazil study.
No, I say Brazil. Okay.
Yeah, it was longitudinal, so they followed people over time. Specifically, 805 Brazilians, all in their 50s, for a period of 8 years.
8 years. Wow, that's a serious amount of time to track changes.
It is. And this analysis, the part we're looking at, was published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, so a relevant publication.
And it seems they had a pretty clear headline finding right from the start.
They really did. Basically, the conclusion was that hearing loss, specifically identified in people in their 50s, was linked to faster cognitive decline later on.
Faster decline.
Yeah. And the big implication is that focusing on your hearing health might actually be a way to help prevent dementia.
Okay, that's definitely a powerful idea.
Yeah.
So how did they figure this out? What did these 805 people actually do over those 8 years?
Well, they did a couple of key things repeatedly. First, audiometry tests.
The standard hearing test.
Exactly. Proper objective hearing tests. They did these 3 times over the 8 years for everyone involved.
So they could precisely track any changes in hearing ability.
Precisely. And then, alongside the hearing tests, they gave everyone a whole battery of cognitive tests.
Measuring things like memory.
Memory, yeah, language skills, and also executive function.
Executive function.
Yeah.
Remind us what that covers again. It's like the brain's CEO.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. So it's higher level things, planning, problem solving, staying focused, making decisions, that kind of stuff.
Got it. So tracking hearing and tracking thinking skills side by side over time.
Right.
And what emerged? What did they find when they looked at the people who, already had some hearing loss when the study began?
Okay. So at the very start, they found that 62 people out of the 805, that's around 7.7%, not a huge number, but significant, already had some level of hearing loss documented.
Right.
And when they looked at that specific group 8 years later, well, those individuals showed significantly faster overall cognitive decline. Faster than you expect, just based on their age.
Faster overall cognitive decline. That seems like a really clear signal.
Yeah.
What about those specific areas like memory or planning? Did they see declines there too?
Yes, they did see signs of that. The results pointed towards declines in memory, verbal fluency, and that executive function we talked about, specifically in the group with hearing loss.
Ah.
The link was statistically strongest for the overall cognitive decline measure in this analysis, but the pattern was there for the specific areas too. It just maybe wasn't quite as statistically precise in this particular paper.
Okay. So this study really adds weight to this idea of hearing loss being what do they call it? A modifiable risk factor for dementia.
Exactly. Modifiable. That's the key word here.
Let's break that down. What does modifiable actually mean in this context?
It simply means it's something we can potentially influence or change. It's not like, say, your genetic makeup, which you can't alter. Hearing loss, well, it can be detected.
Right.
And crucially, it can often be corrected, or at least managed.
Ah, okay.
Claudia Sumoto, one of the researchers, really emphasized this. She pointed out how important this is, particularly for low and middle income countries like Brazil.
Why specifically there?
Well, because dementia rates are expected to rise dramatically in those regions by 2050. Finding risk factors you can actually do something about, like hearing loss, offers a real chance to maybe lessen that future burden, both for individuals and for the healthcare system.
That makes a lot of sense. So the link is there, the decline seems faster, and it's potentially fixable, or at least manageable. But how? What's the proposed connection? How does losing some hearing actually speed up cognitive decline? I think the research suggests a couple of main theories.
That's right. The authors talk about 2 primary mechanisms based on the existing science in this area. The first one has to do with input to the brain.
Input, like information coming in.
Exactly. Think about hearing as a major highway for information getting into your brain. Your brain constantly uses that stream of sound, mixing it with existing knowledge to understand the world, to learn, to respond.
It's like fuel for the processing centers.
Kind of, yeah. It's vital input. So when hearing loss starts to block or muffle that input pathway, those important parts of the brain that process sound and other areas they connect to just aren't getting the same level of stimulation.
They're underworked, maybe.
That's the idea behind this first mechanism. That reduced stimulation, that lack of rich auditory input over time, could directly contribute to cognitive decline speeding up. The brain needs that activity to stay sharp.
Okay, that's one pathway. It makes a certain intuitive sense. What's the second proposed mechanism?
The second one is more about behavior and social interaction. It turns out hearing loss very often leads to social isolation.
Oh, yeah, I can absolutely see how that would happen. Conversations must become much harder work.
They really can.
Yeah.
The researcher, Sumoto, described how difficult it is. Constantly asking people to repeat things, maybe misunderstanding jokes or nuances, needing everyone to speak louder.
That sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
And potentially awkward.
It can be, and over time it can lead people to just withdraw. They might avoid noisy restaurants, stop going to group gatherings, lose interest in conversations because it's just too much effort. They become more isolated.
And we already know from other research that social isolation itself is a big risk factor for cognitive decline and dementia, right?
Exactly. So you could have this kind of 1-2 punch. First, the brain isn't getting the full sensory input it needs directly through the ears. And second, the hearing loss leads to social withdrawal, which is another known risk factor hitting the brain. Both problems stemming from the hearing loss.
Wow. It really shows how connected everything is, our senses, our social lives, our brain function.
It really does.
And this underlines what the study stressed,
There.
the importance of actually detecting hearing loss. Because, like you hinted, people often just adapt, don't they? They don't realize it's happening.
That's a huge point they made. It often creeps up so slowly. Your brain just adjusts, and that quieter world becomes your normal. You might not even notice consciously. That's why getting an objective test, an audiometry test, is so important. It shows you the reality.
And once you know,
you have options. The most common intervention, of course, depending on the type and severity of the loss, is hearing aids.
right, to restore that input pathway we were talking about.
Exactly. But the study also touched on prevention, especially for hearing loss starting in middle age. Were there common causes identified?
Yes, the researcher highlighted a couple of key things for that age group. One big one is noise exposure, particularly at work.
Occupational noise.
Right, which really stresses the need for proper hearing protection in noisy jobs. It's not just an annoyance. It could have these longer-term cognitive implications.
That's a really important connection to make. What else?
The other one mentioned is maybe more widespread using headphones or earbuds at really high volumes.
Yes. That's something many of us probably need to be more mindful of.
Definitely. So the advice seems to be aware of loud noise exposure, and if you have any suspicion at all, or just as a checkup, get your hearing tested. Don't just assume it's fine.
It's clearly about more than just missing a few words here and there. It fits into this larger picture of protecting long-term brain health.
Absolutely. And the researcher actually contextualized hearing loss alongside a whole list of other modifiable risk factors for dementia. You said 11 others.
Yeah, quite a list. It really paints a picture of how multifaceted prevention might be.
Can you give us a few examples from that list just to see where hearing loss fits in?
Sure. Besides hearing loss, the list included things like low levels of education in early life, high blood pressure, hypertension, any kind of traumatic brain injury, diabetes, obesity.
Okay, but a lot of the factors we often hear about.
Right. And also excessive alcohol consumption, smoking, depression, not getting enough physical activity, being sedentary, exposure to air pollution. And interestingly, social isolation itself was on the list too.
Which loops back perfectly to that second mechanism we discussed, doesn't it?
It does. It really highlights these complex interconnections. Hearing loss isn't operating in a vacuum. It sits alongside these other major health and lifestyle factors that all seem to influence our cognitive trajectory as we age.
So if we boil down this deep dive, the main takeaway from this LSA Brazil study seems really clear. Hearing loss, especially starting in middle age, isn't just about your ears. It's linked to your brain aging faster.
A direct link to accelerated cognitive decline.
But the crucial, hopeful part is that it's modifiable. It's something you can potentially detect and address. Protecting your hearing is a concrete step towards protecting your brain.
That's absolutely the core message. It's actionable information based on solid long-term research.
Okay, so thinking about this study and that whole list of modifiable factors from hearing and social life to things like blood sugar, exercise, air quality, how might knowing all this prompt you, our listener, to think a bit differently?
To see the connections between different parts of your health and well-being, perhaps consider what's one small, maybe even unexpected step you could look into now that you understand how something like hearing might ripple outwards to affect your cognitive future.